And hello, everyone. Welcome to your Cowboy radio broadcast. This week's special targets the educating systems of America, and how on a larger scale it is being manipulated into producing a more and more propaganda-prone individual. This can, of course, differ wildly, even just among a state's counties, but the overall degradation and centralized control of schools is a problem that is universal throughout this country. This is one topic that I am very personally passionate about, because I am of the firm belief that hope for a future can only lie in the next generation of kids. These things will continue to change, and the movers of the current day will be taken with it. So if we want to preserve some resemblance of our history and understanding, we need to be taking a more direct approach. Leaving it up to the schools is proven to be catastrophic, as now we have record high numbers of mental illness and child suicide. When you ask kids these days what they want to be when they grow up, they say influencers or esports gamers. What happened to all of the kids who wanted to be astronauts or presidents? That's right, the ones that made it through the battle through the absurdity of society and make it to higher education have either dropped out or are now trapped in crippling decades worth of debt. The youth of this country have been abused and neglected by the establishment for a long time, and in return have abused and neglected their own children, forcing them into the same institutions that made them the way they are. It's a vicious cycle that's only been getting worse with time, and now we've reached a point where most kids are being raised in these schools by teachers who are restrained by the unions and forced to lay out cookie-cutter curriculum plans that offer the student no hope to excel, much less hope to actually find contentment in life. Everyone turns a blind eye to these rotting husks of yesterday and continue to feed their children to it. Then these same people wonder why society is the way it is. With schools being closed this past year, it really showed how little parents were able to actually raise their kids. Instead of taking the initiative and forming pods with other local families or homeschooling, they decided it'd be a better idea to stick them in a Zoom call as if they'll actually learn anything useful there. Most parents were forced to take time off work anyway. It was a perfect opportunity. I'm sure some families did, and their kids will be further ahead, especially in states where schools remain closed. A lot of people will be sitting there saying to themselves, well, I can't teach my kid calculus. And of course, no one expects you to. But are you really going to say you have nothing of value to teach your kid and actually take yourself seriously? Most classes, like such, have no value to the majority of kids anyway. Only to the few that actually choose to specialize in those areas will be able to utilize that kind of knowledge. So why do we have kids leaving school knowing the Pythagorean theorem, but not knowing how to grow their own garden? They should be given opportunities to work with their hands, given classes on philosophy and religion to teach them to think, or at the bare minimum, show them how to produce their own food so they're not forced to rely on the system. As I've said before, I see that not only as a design flaw, but rather an intentional component of the system as a whole. The powers that be don't want citizens to think for them and live for themselves. They want you highly specialized in one area and completely depend on them for everything else. This is how you control intelligentsia, by the way. Force them down a path of debt and entitlement, and you've created a predictable, educated class of people that you can utilize to run your various social and material operations. This isn't to say that these people are not intelligent or that they are not capable of decision-making, but they're being sheltered from viewpoints and experiences that are necessary in one's individualization of thought. By that, I mean that everyone has to be exposed to certain experiences or ideas that challenge their worldview in order to expand or elaborate upon what their current perception is. This just doesn't happen all that much anymore. There's now countless examples of the education system working to strip students of critical thinking, whether it be the removal of AP courses, the critical race theory applications, or the constant pressure on students to go to university, while at the same time stripping them of alternative options. Now, situations will vary quite a bit depending on where we're talking about. Some counties do a really good job preparing their students, while other places, like the cities, do an abysmal, if not horrific job. This is why I'm very pro school of choice. It makes more sense to me to give every parent the $20,000 that's usually allocated to the public schools to decide for their kid whether they want them homeschooled, sent to a private school, or put in the public systems. Teachers' unions will oppose this, and so will many leftist types, because they'll cry either racism or cold-heartedness to the poor, as if they're actually doing them a favor, sending poor and minority kids into these dungeons. I hear from a lot of people in the older generations just how easy this generation has it. While this is true in some aspects, they fail to take into account how wildly different the experiences of children are nowadays. They're not only exposed to an exponential amount of information from a very young age, or at least as soon as they can get in front of a screen, but also entertainment these days is so psychologically trapping they have essentially no choice but to consume. It doesn't help that most small children get a tablet stuck in their face to keep them preoccupied. I actually just heard a story the other day about a baby calling its grandmother Alexa. These kids are going to be messed up and completely dependent on this stuff. Is that really what we want? It does appear that way sometimes, actually. When everything inevitably becomes more and more controlled, it won't be these kids that stay above water. They'll fit in comfortably with the rest of the majority, making minimum wage and consuming whatever it is that the mainstream feeds them. They'll make just enough to spend a little, but never enough to free themselves, always believing their struggles to come from some paper dragon foe. But never, of course, from the hand that feeds, never. They'll be allowed to live their mediocre lives until they serve no further use, and then they'll be disposed of, along with all the other broken establishment toys. It's some sort of neo-feudalism they seem to be going for, actually, as far as I can see, at least. To what end is hard to say, though it's most likely as simple as desire for control, which they have plenty of. Maybe they see the natural disasters on the rise and hope to avoid the worst of it by hiding themselves in the highest of towers. They preach to us to drive electric cars and to recycle more, yet they lounge around on their yachts or take vacations to their many houses around the world, all while flying private planes, and you know for a fact that the children of these people are not being sent to the public schools. So we each have to decide for ourselves to which extent are you going to participate in this. Were you brought here for the sole benefit of some elites, to happily take whatever they give you and in the same motion give them your children as well? I assume most will say of course not. And then if this is so, you must truly affirm that within yourself. It's a topic many would rather just not discuss, but realistically, if you're to have any sort of manageable existence, you must learn how it works. This means being open to the actuality of this place. No more hiding behind what you feel like this place should be, but rather take it how it actually is. Most people can't, or won't, though it can be hard to tell which it is. As far as I can tell, whenever the winds of the mainstream change course, like lemmings, the majority will run themselves off a cliff to chase it. One can see how quickly this can turn into a dystopian nightmare. Like the flip of a switch, an entire society can be turned on its head and warped into something completely unrecognizable. Just look to the Chinese to see a perfect example of this. When the Chinese Communist Party took over the country, they began a process of ethnic and cultural cleansing to create a blank slate population whom they'd be able to manipulate however they wanted. It was brutal, and any opposition was thrown in concentration camps or they were just simply killed. I mean, we're talking about a process that continues to this day, and is even helped by a lot of Western businesses and governments. Forced sterilization, forced labor, organ harvesting, torture, and mass sexual assault are commonplace among many minority groups in their effort to erase any culture that might differ from their hive mind mentality. This has a very, very, very real potential of happening here. It's happened many times in history, and there are only threads keeping this kind of nightmare from reaching our shores. This is why the next generation is so important, and those playing the game realize this. They need to be taught history with a little more urgency, or we're going to find ourselves in a situation where children don't even know who Hitler is. They're going to be going on about their life, never truly knowing the desperate struggle that's been taking place on this planet for thousands of years. And if you think that's a good thing, you couldn't be any more wrong. People will always find problems to complain about, a person to dislike, or an annoyance just in the air. So if you remove the real problems from the equation, you end up with a bunch of make-believe nonsense taking over. Trust me, there's plenty upon plenty of examples to call upon for that one. In fact, a near endless stream at this point. So, this has been a little rant expressing some of my opinions on the current day education system. In all, I award our public schools a grand 3 out of 10. Not a 0, because surprisingly our kids do at least manage to learn some basic English, and maybe they'll even skim through a couple books while they're there. Regardless, there's plenty of things that need to change, and it's going to take some willpower to wade through that swamp. Anyway, thank you all for joining me on this week's Cowboy Radio broadcast. Join me next time for more in-depth analysis and solutions to the problems facing the modern individualist. Signing off for the night, peace.